Welcome back to World War II Radio. I'm your host, John Smith, and I'm joined today with special guest Elliot Johnson. Thank you for coming.
Of course. Thank you for having me on your show today.
The first thing I have to ask you is what made you sign up to fight if you were not drafted?
The attack on Pearl Harbor, that was my main catalyst for going down to the Marine headquarters with my friends. And although I was able to enlist, my friends were declared 4F, were pretty much ineligible because they were lacking some physical requirements.
Can you remember what it was like the night before the invasion of Normandy?
The night before we landed on the beach was very difficult. Nobody could sleep, and a bunch of the guys were playing poker all night. And for some reason, I just had this urge to take a bath. Taking a bath is against the rules, obviously, so I had to settle for a shower.
It was very honorable that you signed up instead of actually getting drafted and conscripted. But how did you, what was the first thing you saw when you went to France in 1944?
I was on a LST, or a landing ship tank, and in that tank we carried smaller landing crafts that we would use to spearhead the invasion. So the first thing that I actually saw was the shells landing in the water, and then as we got closer to the beach, I began to see the floating bodies in the water.
Sounds like quite a hellish landscape. What happened as you got closer to the beach?
As we got closer to the beach, we managed to get on the beach, and my squad and I were able to maneuver around and flank a pocket of Germans that were lighting up our boys. Then as we moved more inland, I saw this anti-aircraft group had made it, and believe it or not, they were sitting around smoking and reading a comic book. Then as soon as I noticed what they were doing, the group sprung into action as 3 German aircraft were coming up into a gun run. We ran for cover. They didn't. Luckily, they had smoked all 3 of them before they could rip us up.
Very lucky indeed. All right, it looks like that's all the time we have for this interview, but thank you so much for sharing that with all of us.
Not a problem. And think about it. This is only the first few hours of combat I went through in my life of war. But thank you for having me on your show, John.
Welcome back to World War II Radio. I'm your host, John Smith, and I'm joined today with a special guest today, Eddie Costello, who's going to tell us a little bit about his personal story from World War II.
Hello, John. Thanks for having me on the show today. Can't wait to tell you my story.
Of course, Eddie. So tell me, when did you first join the service?
I joined the Navy back in 1938, about a year before the fighting broke out. I had a passion for my country and couldn't wait to serve.
Very interesting indeed. So did you serve in the Navy for the entire war?
No. After serving about a year in the Navy, I became a bomber, where I spent most of my time aboard a Boeing B-17.
Very cool. So can you tell us a little bit about your most memorable mission you had during this time as a bomber?
Yeah, of course. I remember it like it was yesterday. The year was 1944, and we were making a standard run over the city of Frankfurt. We bombed the hell out of the city that day, and you could see the smoke for miles. Nothing felt out of the ordinary on that day, but it wasn't until later in life that I learned something tragic that would cause this particular bombing run to stick into my mind.
What in particular was that happened to you?
Well, years later, I met a woman named Ursula Bender, who is one of my good friends till this very day. She told me she lived in Frankfurt during World War II and how the Americans destroyed her town and many things close to her heart. This destroyed me knowing I attacked someone who would eventually become a friend.
Wow, Eddie. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today. It must have been so hard for you to learning about this. I appreciate that you were willing to tell us with us, though, even though it was very tough for you to tell. But thank you, and we'll see you next week on World War II Radio. We're here with Mr. Akira Miuri, a Japanese literature and language professor who grew up in Tokyo during the war. He's here to answer some questions about his first-hand experiences.
Thank you for inviting me here.
It's our pleasure. How was your family affected by the war when it first broke out?
They were all impacted very differently. Both of my sisters had married, and both of their husbands were drafted, though only one died in combat. My older brother was also drafted and died in a plane crash just 4 months before the end of the war.
That must have been very rough on you and your parents.
It was a very difficult part of our lives.
How did they feel about the war in general?
My father was ambivalent at first. He had studied at Oxford but came back to Japan to teach. I thought he was pro-West secretly, but he hid it and became quite patriotic.
How did the war change schools and jobs? You were in the middle school when it happened.
Humanities were drafted much more than in the sciences and math departments. We were taught how to march and to shoot, though I was never drafted. No one questioned it much.
And it wasn't until a couple of years later when the raids came, right?
Yes, that was when all the high schools closed and we worked in the factories. The younger children were evacuated to the country.
And one more final question. Did anything good come out of the war for you or your family?
Just one nice thing. I met my wife.
Well, thank you for being with us here today, and thank you for the story for our listeners. Listen next time on World War II Radio.